The disgusting truth about menstrual hygiene during the Victorian era. Women have had periods ever since before our species completely developed, but were people as educated about menstruation as they are now? How did women in the Victorian era deal with menstruation hygiene? Let's find out. Everyone nowadays has access to convenience. The majority of us could still buy soap and shampoo even at the lowest wage levels, since we had dependable heating and indoor plumbing. This wasn't the case in earlier times, though. The lowest classes used to take baths quite seldom throughout the Middle Ages. The 19th century, which was dominated by the urge for development despite the terrible poverty that entangled many families, continued to experience many of the dark aspects of the Dark Ages. Current scenarios. While we're still a long way from achieving period fairness globally, our culture has made great strides in terms of our understanding of menstruation and the tools we use to control our monthly cycles. Today, we have better access than ever before to a varied selection of period products to meet the requirements of everyone who menstruates. We're trying to eradicate the stigmas connected with periods, and we're just a click away from accurate information about menstrual health. But you might be surprised to learn that things look drastically different even during our parents' first periods. What happened before that? How have periods evolved? Let's discuss the evolution of menstruation. What did people think about menstruation? Medical authors from the 19th century undoubtedly appeared to be persuaded that women were utter wrecks during their periods. Dr. James McGrigor Allen said at the Anthropological Society of London in 1869 that women were invalids and unfit for any significant mental or physical labor when they were menstruating. John Harvey Kellogg, a health reformer, said in his 1891 book, Ladies' Guide to Health and Disease, that girls' growth needed to rest entirely during menstruation. Teenage girls should be freed from burdensome tasks of every kind and permitted to surrender themselves to the sensation of malaise, which normally comes over her at this time, lazing on the sofa or utilizing her time as she pleases. Menstruation and the Victorian era. Women in the Victorian era mostly carried on as usual during their periods, although they did follow some of the longest-standing customs about menstrual health. However, most women did not have the luxury of taking a few days off work just because they were menstruating. Women's self-care during periods isn't often mentioned in 19th century diaries. They seem to have kept up with their customary domestic and family responsibilities. Both medical professionals and lay people have had a humoral knowledge of the body since at least the time of Hippocrates. They held that for the body to remain healthy, the four humors, blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, had to be properly balanced and circulated. It was believed that menstruation helped women get rid of extra blood from their bodies. Various illnesses might arise in the body if the blood did not circulate and instead stagnated. Instead of being recognized as a symptom of systemic diseases like cancer and TB, menstrual suppression was thought to be the root cause of such lethal conditions. As a result, women continued to do the majority of their daily labor, but they shied away from tasks they thought might stop the flow. The most important safety measure was to stay warm, whether that meant taking a bath, doing the laundry in cold water, or working outside in chilly, rainy weather. Ancient mentalities. Let's go back to the times when menstruation was first mentioned in writing, to prehistoric societies. It's crucial to remember that, until very recently, only males had the knowledge, authority, and influence necessary to write and preserve history. We have very little written information regarding periods because the majority of guys don't menstruate, and what little information we do have may seem foolish to you. Periods in Victorian times. Unfortunately, Victorian views on menstruation were not much different. People would go to tremendous measures to conceal their periods because of religious stigma, and some even thought cramps were God's retribution for Eve's initial sin. Menstruating women weren't given painkillers since they were considered to be being punished for having cramps, mostly herbal remedies at the time. People used to think that burning a toad and carrying the ashes in a bag around your waist would cure cramps to lessen the discomfort. Makes you feel grateful for heating pads and ibuprofen. People in medieval times would either free bleed or use cloths to absorb their blood. Ever wonder where the expression "on the rag" comes from? During the Victorian era, the first menstruation products were created in the late 19th century when periods reached their Bridgeton phase. People wore sanitary belts, which were essentially reusable pads tied to a belt worn around the waist, from the 1890s through the early 1980s. Yes, they were as painful as they sounded. The reusable pad component was an excellent idea, but the belts were cumbersome and frequently leaked. They would fold enormous linen squares into rectangles, or fold a larger piece of linen into one compact rectangle, shove it between their thighs, and clutch for grim death to get through their periods. This was the mechanical aspect of how they dealt with their periods. The most effective method for keeping it there was to amble around the dusty streets in a languid manner and with little steps, which would only leave a single line of imprints. About tampons, this was unexpectedly not an unheard-of occurrence at all. In early manuals, suppositories are described as being crafted from a smooth stick covered in absorbent linen rags and tightly sewn. These suppositories were used in the private spot. A lengthy rope was inserted into the seam. Some are disposable while others are reusable after being boiled. Herbal treatments were frequently utilized back in the day to treat a variety of ailments, including menstrual cramps. The first disposable pads. Johnson & Johnson's Lister's towels were the first disposable pads to enter the market in 1888, and during World War I, nurses substituted cellulose bandages for their reusable ones in the early 20th century. However, the belts remained to secure the disposable pads in position. The core technology of tampons hasn't altered all that much since the 1930s, when the first ones initially appeared on the market, except for improved applicators. The 1800s to 1900, the turn of the century, from poverty to wealth. For the majority of the 1800s, flannel, or woven fabric menstruation cloths manufactured at home, also known as on the rag, were the standard in civilizations in Europe and North America. By the turn of the century, worries about bacterial development from improperly cleaning reusable items in between uses led to the emergence of a new hygiene industry for menstruation. The earliest menstruation cups, which were often made of aluminum or hard rubber, rubber trousers, literally bloomers or underwear lined with rubber, and Lister's towels were among the 20 menstrual goods for which patents were obtained between 1854 and 1915, a precursor to maxi pads. Even though products were being sold door to door by the 1870s, the first commercial goods that were accessible to the general public first appeared in catalogs in the 1890s. Around the same period, menstrual products like the antiseptic and absorbent pad and ladies' elastic doily belt, a silk and elastic belt to which you would attach a pad, were produced. However, even though manufacturers were starting to recognize the demand for these items, customers were still reluctant to be seen using them due to moral taboos surrounding menstruation. A prime example is the commercial failure of Lister towels, the original cotton and gauze disposable pad that was introduced in 1896. It's a complex subject when it comes to women having fewer periods than we do now. It has historically and internationally been linked to lunar cycles, which suggests that once a month is roughly average. Is it possible that women in the Victorian era had less frequent periods than we do today? Feel free to skip everything that follows because it will be informed guesswork and sheer supposition. It was not exactly a time recognized for an excellent diet or health care. Even if you were an upper-class person living in the Victorian era, you very certainly checked off more than one of these categories. It's quite conceivable for a woman's periods to lessen or even stop altogether due to the 16-hour workdays and ongoing, unremitting physical exercise. It happens frequently even today in female marathon runners or bodybuilders. Therefore, while it seems unlikely that women today have fewer cycles than they did in the past, it's also entirely possible that women in that era and location had fewer cycles than what is considered medically normal. This ends our history lesson for today. What are your thoughts on the hygiene of the Victorian era? Tell us in the comments. Also, like, share, and subscribe to the channel to know all about history and health. See you next time.